The room was silent long before the message finished playing. No one breathed. No one moved. On the central display, the transmission continued to loop, unaltered, unencrypted, impossibly consistent. Come to the Alaric span. One ship. No weapons. No deception. The words had already been parsed by every decryption grid and linguistics algorithm in Earth's network. No hidden codes. No syntax drift. Just 13 syllables, repeated every 22 seconds across 219 relay points, spanning the Orion Line, the Ventari Belt, even nodes deep inside refugee-controlled space. For 6 days straight, the message pulsed without deviation. And for 6 days, Strategic Command debated whether to answer it or erase it from record. The Alaric span wasn't just uncharted territory, it was avoided on principle. The site of the triad vanishing. 3 ships, 37 crew, no debris, no distress signal, nothing. The span had become shorthand in naval training rooms for tactical suicide. Command's war table projected 15 different outcomes from responding. 13 of them ended in full vessel loss within 4 minutes of entry. The remaining 2 assumed errors in the simulation. No predictive model offered survival. And yet one subroutine, classified level tau, used only for anomaly-based logic deviations, flagged a different classification entirely. Didactic pattern, a teaching structure. The suggestion was dismissed without discussion. Not because it wasn't possible, but because it wasn't palatable. The Zarn Collective had never taught anyone anything. They conquered, rewrote, erased. They had no schools, no known doctrine of education. Their entire empire functioned on biological assimilation and strategic burn cycles. The idea that they might want to communicate, let alone share knowledge, wasn't just absurd, it was dangerous. And yet no fleet deployments had moved into the span, no sensor pings, no cloaked reinforcements, not a single hostile vector emerged since the message began. It was by all definitions the quietest front Earth had ever monitored. The debate shifted, not from fear to hope, but from risk to optics. The longer Earth did nothing, the more it looked like indecision. The signal had leaked to at least one trading guild, and silence could be interpreted as strategic paralysis. So the Commission made a decision and then made sure to distance themselves from it. They pulled one name from their retirement archives, Commander Harkin Druz. Once a fleet strategist with a dozen high-priority campaigns under his name, Dress had fallen out of favor for his public critiques on Earth's doctrine. He believed war was not just about survival, but about memory. That conquest without understanding bred eventual retaliation. That failure should be studied, not buried. None of those views earned him popularity, and none of them prevented him from being the ideal candidate now. A quiet, expendable mind who had once argued that truth was the final weapon in any prolonged conflict. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him reliable. Dress didn't ask questions when summoned. He boarded the Commission's skydock in standard civilian attire, no rank displayed. He sat through the briefing in silence, accepted the mission without protest, and only asked for one detail before signing the reactivation order. Manual override controls. The Commission tried to refuse. Dress stared through them until they approved it. The Vindicator 7 was pulled from mothball storage, stripped of its AI combat architecture, and fitted with analog backups, manual steering, redundant shielding, heat sink lines that hadn't been used in 2 decades. A courier-class stealth vessel, small enough to be missed by long-range scans, fast enough to break orbit without drive signatures. It carried no weapons, no signal scramblers, no fleet support. The mission directive was simple. Enter the Alaric span. Do not engage. Do not respond. Record everything. Return with truth or proof of extinction. The launch protocol was short. No military procession. No coverage. Dress climbed into the cockpit alone, sealed the hatch and keyed in his own biometric locks. He ran one diagnostic sweep, not for ship readiness, but for control integrity. Every wire led back to him. That was all he needed. As Earth rotated beneath the stars and the station fell behind, the hull of the Vindicator reflected the last of human civilization like a blade drifting from its forge. Dress did not pray. He did not transmit farewells. He adjusted the orientation thrusters by hand and set the course through dead space. No autopilot, no satellite triangulation, just silence and trajectory. The black edge of the Yalaric span did not glow. It did not shimmer or pulse or warn. It simply existed, an inert scar on every navigational chart. Dress leaned back as the stars began to stretch into their long, silent streaks. His heart did not race. His breath stayed even. He had expected noise, resistance, at least a flicker of fear, but there was only the cold hum of life support and the slight resistance of the control stick beneath his fingers. He didn't look back. Earth had made its move. Now it was time to see who, if anyone, was playing the other side. Dress had expected static. Blind scans, misaligned readings, drifting signal debris. Instead, he saw order. Precise, unnatural order. The moment Vindicator 7 breached the Walaric span's outer edge, the ship's gravitational lens flared, then flattened. Surrounding him wasn't open space or battlefield clutter, but something closer to architecture. Thousands of hull fragments rotated in mathematically locked orbits, suspended in motionless rhythm. Planetary wreckage, chunks of asteroid fields, entire satellite arrays, splintered orbital platforms, hung frozen in gravitational calibration. There was no drift, no collision, no decay. These were not the artifacts of war. They were pieces of a structure held in a suspended ballet by artificial balance. Nothing moved independently. Nothing responded to his entry. The system did not ping. It observed. Ahead, the anomaly took shape. A massive radial construct coalescing from the gravitational web. A ring of starship bones, fused nose to hull, wing to keel, in a pattern too deliberate to be natural. The outer loop alone spanned 2,000 kilometers across. The wreckage had been stacked with symmetry, the damage sculpted to fit into a seamless frame. Terran hulls gleamed dull gray between panels of cracked Zarn alloy, their heat shielding peeled back like burnt parchment. In between were vessels no database recognized, some older than any war humans had recorded. Dress brought the ship closer on silent approach, cutting all emissions. No defense systems triggered. His sensors showed power signatures so faint they hovered near thermal background noise. Still, the ring glowed softly under its own gravity. Each ship hull catching fractured light in different wavelengths, like a cathedral ceiling catching morning sun through broken glass. He recognized the Minerva Concorde's nose section first, blunted, scorched, but unmistakable from the twin ion intakes etched with the old Third Fleet crest. It had been missing for 13 years, declared lost in first contact operations. Now it sat embedded in the inner rim of the ring, aligned perfectly with the prow of a Zarn destroyer. Their respective hulls welded not by force, but fused along pressure lines as if mended together after death. These weren't scraps. They were memorials or messages. Dress narrowed the camera feed and began a slow rotation around the structure. There were no signs of communication, no movement, no radiation bursts, just the slow tick of external processors logging heat curves and reflective spectra. Then something shifted, not visually but kinetically. A tug, smooth, calculated, hooked into Vindicator 7's starboard inertial anchor. The ship didn't shake or jolt. It was drawn forward with the precision of a mechanic's hand pulling a bolt from fluid. Tractor field, Dress confirmed immediately. Non-standard, Zarn origin. But it behaved like no capture net he had ever faced. The ship wasn't being taken. It was being placed. Inside the hangar shell, everything was quiet. He expected containment fields, hostile interfaces, borders. None came. The interior architecture of the docking array was ancient, layered in pressure-welded metal and black glass shielding, but not recent. It looked dormant, like a museum closed for decades, still pristine under dust. Dress didn't leave the cockpit. He ran a full external sweep, triggered passive sterilization cycles, and initiated his quarantine buffer. No breach warnings, no trace of biologics or nanosaturation. Still, his fingers stayed on the manual override. Then the console lit up. Not from the ship's system, but from a secondary source layered directly through the analog interface. The screen dimmed, flickered once, and reinitialized under a new layout. Clean, silent, non-invasive. In the center, a single prompt. Lesson access, Sequence 117, no encryption, no data flood, no transmission demands, just a blinking cursor and an implied invitation. Draze didn't trust it. He didn't touch the screen. Instead, he activated a three-layer air-gap firewall, isolating the system from external communication. He detached the memory root from central access, ran a diagnostic trace on every port, and checked power allocation line by line. Nothing intrusive registered, no hostile code. The system remained clean. The lesson wasn't being forced. It was being offered. He tapped the access key once. The screen didn't explode in streams of Zarn language or cascade through indecipherable glyphs. It opened a tree, a file system, time-stamped, categorized, and annotated in precise alignment with Zarn military documentation protocols. Each entry bore system logs, strategic error codes, field feedback loops, and visual records. Not propaganda, not summaries, full unredacted battle data. Some of it from Zarn perspectives, some from alien fleets they had tried and failed to suppress. There were collapses of forward bases, cancellations of full-scale campaigns, internal command disagreements, tactical blunders. Dress leaned in, parsing the details. These weren't edited reports. They weren't tailored to confuse or manipulate. They were records of defeat. And then came Earth, a separate folder, isolated, indexed differently. It bore no celebratory headers, no marks of hostility, just a title: Irregulars, Homo sapiens, Profile 117. Inside were recorded encounters, military failures, diplomatic breakdowns, infiltration collapses. Each entry highlighted a deviation: Terran officers abandoning command protocol to aid civilian populations, squads disobeying chain of command to shield non-aligned species, unexpected sabotage missions launched not for tactical gain, but to avenge captured prisoners without state authorization. Duirez watched as Zarn's shock troopers hesitated on battlefield scans, refusing to advance due to memory-triggered behavior sequences. Earth's unpredictable decisions hadn't made them dangerous. It had made them impossible to model. These were not trophies. They were warnings, or acknowledgments. And yet nowhere in the files did the Zarn curse humanity. There was no language of vengeance, no tones of blame. Instead, the lesson tree built upward, each defeat not erased, but used to refine the next protocol. The deeper Dress went, the clearer it became. The Zarn didn't learn from victory. They learned from what destroyed them. His ship remained untouched. The hangar was silent, yet his pulse slowed. For the first time, he understood. The span wasn't designed to lure him. It wasn't even about him. It was a classroom built from the wreckage of everything the Zarn had failed to control, and Earth was the last chapter in that curriculum. He closed the final window, and the screen blanked. The lesson wasn't over. It had just begun. Dress worked through the archive with the detached focus of a war analyst. But the longer he read, the more that detachment frayed. Each file was structured with the same core logic: event identification, anomaly tagging, post-failure analysis. But the content broke every expectation. There was no cohesion in the losses. The reasons varied: tactical misjudgment, psychological collapse, terrain misreading, but the result was always the same: systemic failure. Each entry detailed a moment where Zarn operational superiority should have guaranteed victory. Instead, something inexplicable had occurred: a retreat where none was logical, a prisoner released by a Terran unit under heavy fire, a fleet mutiny to protect a single species with no alliance value. Dress ran file checks again, verifying data structure, metadata, source integrity. Every bit aligned with Zarn internal timestamping, language formatting, and uncompressed logic mesh. There were no interpolations, no reconstruction gaps, and more importantly, no edits to save face. The casualty reports didn't align with command projections. Declassified post-action logs showed commanders confessing error. Entire Zarn divisions had submitted voluntary debriefings after collapse, not to shift blame, but to update procedural understanding. It was too flawed to be forged. No enemy fakes their losses this well. He leaned back and let the realization settle. Not like a theory, but like the sound of boots stepping into untouched snow. The Zarn didn't suppress knowledge of failure. They archived it, and they didn't do it to study how to better win next time. They did it to understand why they failed at all. Victory wasn't preserved in their records. Collapse was. It wasn't doctrine, it was pedagogy. The Zarn culture had long been assumed to revolve around domination, erasure, and cycle-based conquest. That assumption now cracked in his mind like old ceramic under pressure. They didn't erase their mistakes. They built around them. Every loss fed back into a learning system, one that changed not to exploit the same weakness again, but to restructure their perception of the species that defeated them. The archives weren't blueprints for retaliation. They were educational scaffolds. Dress focused on the Terran files next. The tone shifted. Earlier entries cataloged tactical setbacks and skirmish-level defeats. But the deeper he dug, the more disturbing the failures became. Not in their scale, but in their unpredictability. Zarn units had faced Terran fleets outnumbered and still lost. Not because of firepower, but because the humans disobeyed their own battle logic. In one case, a Terran corvette ignored a chance to disable a Zarn warship to rescue a trapped civilian convoy, one that held no political or military value. The action delayed their fleet's response by 30 minutes, causing a wider collapse in the Terran sector grid. But the humans had made the choice anyway. Another file showed a Marine squad intentionally jamming their own comms and leaving secure zones to retrieve a captured enemy scout they believed had surrendered, despite having orders to ignore non-priority captives. They succeeded. That act triggered a collapse in the Zarn biofeedback trust cascade, rendering 4 other planetary operations defunct. The moments weren't heroic. They were erratic, illogical, acts of defiance that operated outside cost-benefit frameworks. Moral anomalies, tactical deviations. Not rebellion from orders, but rebellion from predictability. Humans didn't win because they were better. They won because they consistently chose what no model could account for, and the Zarn didn't view it as chaos. They viewed it as something they couldn't mimic, and so they chose to observe it instead. As Dress scrolled through visual footage, he watched the helmet feed of a human soldier refusing to activate a targeting sequence because a cluster of alien non-combatants were within collateral radius. His squad leader ordered fire. The man dropped his rifle. The engagement ended in failure, but the hesitation triggered a cross-species sympathy response that fractured local support for the Zarn. Another clip showed a captured Terran commander advising his Zarn interrogator on how to save his wounded subordinates, even while under threat. Dress paused the footage and stared at the frozen expression on the Zarn's face. It wasn't disgust, it was confusion. The file ended with a note. Emotional recursion loop triggered. Engagement plan withdrawn. He stopped reading. He didn't need to go further. The final folder was unmarked, sitting at the base of the lesson tree. It contained no video, no tactical data, just a single document. Simple font, monospace type, short line. You are our final correction. Drays sat back in his chair, hand hovering near the manual override, but no longer because of fear. The dread had shifted into something heavier, a kind of resignation, not to threat, but to understanding. This wasn't a setup. It wasn't even a warning. It was a message. The entire structure, the wreath, the tractor field, the seamless dock, wasn't designed to capture or intimidate. It was designed to create stillness, focus. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a classroom, one built not by victors, but by survivors who chose to learn from what broke them. And Earth. Earth had become the last course in their curriculum. The Zarn had brought him here not because they feared him, but because they needed him to understand that he was never the target. Humanity's errors, instincts, and moral fractures had rendered them unreadable to the Zarn systems. And rather than retaliate, they preserved the anomaly as instruction. Earth was not the exception, it was the final example. A species whose unpredictable behavior forced an empire of conquerors to shift their entire model of learning. Dress stared at the console. The prompt had faded. There was nothing left to open, nothing left to decode. For the first time in his career, there was no analysis to write, no victory to measure, no protocol to refine. The archive didn't need a response. It had already been received. The release was almost insultingly gentle. No alarms, no countdown. Just a quiet shift in magnetic drift, and Vindicator 7 decoupled from the hangar lattice. The guidance field nudged it free, slowly pushing it back into neutral drift. Systems reinitialized on their own, re-establishing passive control as if 12 hours hadn't passed. Dress ran a double check on his core modules. All intact. Fuel tanks still reading full. Nav data uncorrupted. The only changes were in his mind. Subtle shifts, like internal recalibrations he couldn't name. He didn't speak, didn't log a report. He didn't activate the return beacon until the ship had already begun acceleration back toward Terran space. There was no need for urgency, no need for drama. He had what they wanted, but not what they expected. His silence reached strategic command before his vessel did. The lack of transmission drew suspicion long before the retrieval vessel intercepted him. By the time Vindicator 7 was pulled into the docking bay, an emergency security team was already waiting in pressure armor. Dress stepped out alone, hands visible, face blank. He offered no resistance, no words. The ship was impounded without ceremony. His personal console was disconnected and rushed to a secure quarantine vault before he even left the airlock. Protocol didn't account for stillness. It didn't know what to do with someone who didn't fight. He was confined to an observation wing beneath the Lunar Bastion complex. No windows, no AI access. He was fed on routine intervals and spoken to only by debriefing officers trained in counter-psychological protocols. They accused him of system contamination, of soft code hallucination. They ran neural pattern diagnostics, memory resonance scans, hormonal consistency tests. Everything came back stable, no anomalies. Then they accused him of being compromised, of absorbing a Zarn algorithm and mistaking it for empathy. Duress didn't answer, not because he lacked words, but because there were none that would make them listen. The review panel convened 6 days later. By then, his logs had been decrypted, combed through, and flagged for internal contradictions, except there weren't any. The data verified itself line by line. Zarn time signatures matched historical bursts known only to deep-range intelligence archives. Signal trails cross-referenced with prior ghost transmissions dated back nearly 2 decades. Not one packet showed signs of tampering. The simulation footage, tactical metadata, and command decisions were all consistent with what the Zarn would have stored, had anyone ever believed they stored anything. There were no glorious deaths, no last stands, only hesitation, reconsideration, foresight rewritten by collapse. It wasn't defeat they preserved. It was adaptation. Command refused to accept it. The Admiralty called the files a trap. Some high-ranking officers accused the entire event of being a soft incursion, a new form of psychological warfare designed to fracture Terran cohesion. Dress watched their panic from behind reinforced glass. He said nothing. There was no war coming. That was what frightened them most. Days passed. The world moved, and the Zarn moved with it, but not toward Earth. Their fleets began to withdraw from the outer sectors. Observation posts powered down. Relay drones ceased orbit and burned off in atmospheric drifts. No messages followed, no terms. They didn't even bother with diplomatic channels. They simply left, like a tide receding not from fear, but from completion. No system was targeted. No human vessel was challenged. They didn't run. They exited, quietly, deliberately, and that silence detonated louder than any bombardment. The public caught on first. Traffic logs from remote traders showed clear jumps in Zarn withdrawal patterns. Civilian observers started sharing unconfirmed sightings of empty Zarn corridors. Then a minor guild station found itself reclassified overnight, from conflict adjacent to free navigation. The media caught scent of the shift and spun their theories with predictable heat. Some hailed it as proof of deterrence, that Earth's strength had finally pushed the Zarn into retreat. Others whispered of trap vectors, soft resets, a new kind of war looming just beyond perception. The headlines bloated with speculation, but Dress ignored everyone. He remained silent through every press cycle, through every official inquiry, through every invitation to explain himself. He refused interviews, declined hearings, and gave no testimony. He had already delivered everything they needed. If they still required a voice, then they hadn't understood the lesson. Behind closed doors, the Naval Doctrine Commission met an emergency session, not to craft war plans, but to revise core assumption matrices. The data from Vindicator 7 had proven irrefutable. The files were real, their implications even more so. The Commission issued its first confidential rewrite in 2 decades, a full reevaluation of Earth's threat modeling system. No announcement was made, no policy shift declared, but the curriculum changed. Deep inside the Naval Academy servers, a new entry appeared. Flagged restricted as Doctrine 117, it was locked behind multiple encryption layers, accessible only to training officers and War College instructors. And it contained every fragment of what Dress had seen. The rewrite wasn't about tactics, it was about perception. Earth wasn't under siege. It had become an object of study. The Zarn hadn't disengaged to regroup. They had disengaged because their curriculum was complete. Dress was released without statement, no apology, no commendation. He walked out of the compound in civilian clothes and vanished into the quiet corners of Earth's side systems. He left no forwarding address, filed no lawsuits. He wasn't interested in vindication. His role had never been to convince, it had been to witness. And what he had seen was never intended to be turned into doctrine. It was meant to be remembered. The change didn't arrive with a speech. There was no banner across the skyline, no anthem playing beneath a declaration. The shift came as a silent patch, an unnoticed update pushed into the training modules of command track institutions across Earth's defense academies. New folders appeared in the restricted curriculum servers, marked not by fleet symbols or classified markers, but by a numeric code, 117. Inside were simulations, not heroic replays of decisive battles or successful maneuvers, but models of hesitation, collapse, redirection. They were sourced from Zarn archival data, left untouched save for translation overlays and timestamp conversions. Entire class cycles now began not with conflict scenarios, but with records of failure, specifically failures to predict human deviation. Cadets found themselves studying operations where Earth's forces disobeyed orders, rerouted fire to protect non-aligned species, sacrificed objectives to secure lives that held no tactical relevance. They weren't told to judge the decisions, only to understand the consequences. The simulations didn't end with victory. They ended with confusion, with Zarn hesitating mid-campaign, with enemy AI subroutines rewriting priorities mid-fight, with systems breaking not because of human strength, but because humans refused to behave like algorithms. These weren't triumphs. They were disruptions, and they were now required study. The Naval Doctrine Commission didn't offer an explanation to the public. Internal memos simply stated that Directive 117 was part of an adaptive training initiative. There was no mention of Zarn archives, of Dres, or of the Alaric span. Official doctrine remained outwardly unchanged. Earth still prepared for war. Fleet patrols continued. Border sensors remained active. But inside the war colleges and strategic divisions, something quiet took hold. Reflection. Not on how to defeat others, but on how Earth's unpredictability had already reshaped an empire. It wasn't pride, it wasn't guilt, it was recognition. Harkin Dress never returned to duty. The second retirement was final. There was no public announcement, no closed-door ceremony. He declined the honorary rank they offered, refused the service medal commissioned in his name, and turned down every request for commentary. He purchased a small atmospheric dome on a minor outworld near the edge of legal settlement zones and registered it under a false identity. Surveillance confirmed his residence, but the report noted no visitors, no broadcasts, no signs of ongoing analysis. Just a quiet man who'd once walked through the heart of an alien archive and decided that silence was more powerful than victory. The wider population never learned the full details. News cycles had long since moved on. With no enemy movements and no escalation, the Zarn faded from the public radar. Their absence was interpreted as retreat, perhaps deterrence. Some political voices spun it into proof of Earth's dominance, talking points for campaign platforms and fleet budget renewals. The reality, of course, never made it into the feeds, that an empire had studied Earth not to copy its firepower, but to understand its irrationality. That a species had walked away not in fear, but in learning. That humanity had become a case study, not a threat. The last official sighting of the Zarn came from an unmanned exploration vessel near the Turex front, a low-orbit probe recording gravitational drift patterns on a barren world. In the background, barely visible in the static, a Zarn relay drone drifted. No weapons, no data bursts. It did not engage. It did not respond. It turned slightly, adjusted position, then remained in place. A listener. That was all. Back on Earth, the War College overhauled its entrance protocols. Recruits no longer began training with simulations of battlefront heroism. Instead, they were presented with fractured scenarios from Zarn archives, scenes where human unpredictability had changed the direction of a campaign. The objective wasn't to emulate those moments, it was to understand what those moments meant to those observing from the outside. Psychological profiling was introduced as part of command exams, not to test loyalty, but to identify which minds were most likely to act without prior permission. Recruits were no longer filtered solely for compliance. They were evaluated for the possibility of deviation. One section of the exam was handwritten, an open essay. The question changed with each cycle, but its intent remained. It never asked how to win. It asked how to be remembered. The most recent variant read, "Describe a moment where failure reshaped a mission outcome more profoundly than success. What was learned? What was lost?" There was no correct answer, only perspective. Some cadets failed outright. Others began their essays with quotes from archives they could never fully understand. No one spoke of Ilaric Spawn. The wreath of wreckage remained unvisited. Official policy deemed it a close coordinate, off limits to civilian and military traffic alike. No one touched it, but everyone trained beneath its shadow. The doctrine had changed, not by vote, not by war, but by a lesson taught not with words, but with ruins. Earth had always assumed it would need to prove itself to survive. Instead, it had become a curriculum, and the war they feared had already ended, not in silence, but in observation. The enemy hadn't vanished. It had graduated. The academy walls had always echoed with orders, marches, drills, simulations measured down to the second. But now every cadet began their final week in silence. No squad exercises, no fleet formations, just a chair, a screen, and a prompt drawn from Directive 117. There were no combat scenarios, no enemy formations to decrypt. Instead, they were shown failure. Not theirs, humanity's. Footage from Zarn archives played in clinical quiet, each entry beginning with the same identifier. Irregular event, human variant. The cadets watched soldiers abandon orders to save lives. Officers dismantle objectives to uphold ethics. Medics override protocol for the sake of a captured enemy. Some scenes ended in death, others in nothing at all. But all of them ended the same way. Confusion, not by humans, by the ones watching them. Instructors did not interpret the clips. There were no lessons scrawled on the walls, no tactical equations to solve. The simulations were never explained. They were only observed, and afterward each cadet was asked to write. Alone, unprompted, unrestricted. The question had no rubric. It sat at the bottom of the screen like a final verdict, waiting to be spoken aloud. When your species is remembered, will it be for what it conquered or what it taught? Some wrote about wars. Some didn't mention battles at all. The essays were not judged for content, but for presence of mind. It was the only test that wasn't scored, only read. The final requirement before command candidacy. Most would forget what they wrote within a decade, but the Zarn wouldn't. Harkan Dress was never named in the curriculum. His legacy was not inscribed in stone or preserved in the officer registry. He appeared only in rumor, a quiet figure in older cadet briefings, sometimes referenced during informal strategy sessions. No one could confirm his location. No one asked aloud. But those who passed Directive 117 often spoke of him in a way that didn't require validation. Somewhere they believed the man who first opened the archive was still watching. And he was. On a windless world near the edge of the Zoran cloud, a pale shore circled a saltwater lake, the color of faded steel. A structure stood half buried in the dunes, its dome patched from cargo hull scraps, its antenna turned not to Earth, but toward deep space. Inside, Drace monitored telemetry from three long-range probes, not armed, not encrypted, not even marked with Terran registry codes. They moved through young systems quietly, pausing only when motion drew near. Their sensors weren't calibrated to detect threat. They were tuned for signal shifts, for hesitation, for choice. Dress hadn't written a report in years. He hadn't been asked to. But the probes logged every instance of deviation. He reviewed them in silence. The Tsar never returned, not in fleets, not in warnings. But their presence lingered at the edges of known space. Their relays no longer transmitted challenges. They simply drifted, recalibrating every solar cycle. And then, one cycle before the probes were due for decommission, a signal arrived. Brief, minimal. Lesson acknowledged, awaiting next anomaly. It contained no demand, no judgment, no command, only recognition. Back in Earth's orbit, defense satellites continued their rotations. Fleet carriers still patrolled transit lanes. The weapons systems remained online. Humanity hadn't disarmed, it hadn't grown soft, but it had changed its posture. It no longer pointed every array outward. It pointed some of them back inward, not to watch for betrayal, but to listen for mistake, to find where its own models cracked. The silence was no longer a threat. It was a mirror. The final image in every War College orientation now came without sound. A slow pan over Earth's upper atmosphere. Strategic platforms in place. Shipyards still glowing with output, but no fleet movement, no active alert. Just presence. Intentional. Still. Beneath it, one line appeared on every screen. Humanity did not win the war, it became the curriculum. And so cadets trained not to conquer, but to understand how the ones they fought might remember them when the war ended. Not as victors, not as victims, but as the variable no simulation could break, and the question every future species would eventually be asked. What would your answer be to the final question? Will humanity be remembered for what it conquered or what it taught? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story made you think twice about war, memory, or what comes after, hit that subscribe button. Stay sharp, stay human,